too urgent, too important to allow the process to unfold as it has for the last generation.
California's $320 billion budget is now law, but the process came with strings attached. Governor Gavin Newsom signed 2 major bills, but not without a controversial move, leaving environmentalists disappointed.
Gavin Newsom, the governor of the state of California, actually did something good. Gavin Newsom, the absolute scumbag that is currently the governor of the state of California, did something that was smart. Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Sean, and today I got to talk about Gavin Newsom partially making some improvements in one of California's absolute worst laws that, by the way, has been proven out for decades to be one of the #1 drivers of housing prices going through the roof, in that it is used oftentimes to restrict building, and he actually rolled it back minimally, but at least it's something. It's going in the correct direction. However, one of the things that I notice about the broader proposal, what gets beyond the headlines, is that for whatever ungodly, ridiculously stupid reason, he decided to do one of those 2 steps forward, maybe 1 step back kind of things, where he ended up making this kind of stupider by just adding these other provisions. So we're going to break this whole thing down. We're going to talk about this. But before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
Yeah, Laura, some called it a poison pill because the governor signed the budget last week, but he said his signature would be invalid if the lawmakers didn't make changes to CEQA. And tonight, he got his way.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Pen to paper. Governor Gavin Newsom signed 2 bills, AB 130 and SB 131. They strip away key parts of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which for decades gave environmentalists and communities the power to block projects they disagreed with.
The most consequential housing reforms that we've seen in modern history in the state of California. Long overdue, absolutely.
So look, Gavin Newsom describes this as the most important housing reform in California in decades, and honestly, I agree, even though, again, this is just a baby steps kind of maneuver, as it only covers projects of, I believe, 50 units or less, but considering additional regulations in the city of New York when you build apartment buildings kick in at 5 units or more, I can't really say anything against that other than congratulations to Ezra Klein. Your abundance agenda has already had a devastating impact on the Democratic regulatory regime, and I hope that this will lead to lower housing prices, more building, and all the other positive things that should have been happening in California all along. But to understand this, again, you guys need to understand what CEQA is, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, and essentially, this is a law that was signed by Ronald Reagan in the late 60s to early 70s. However, shortly after it was signed, there was a CEQA lawsuit that was filed that essentially made the ability for anybody in the state of California to sue basically any developer or any project developer for any reason, and this ironically included a bunch of different green infrastructure projects that they ended up filing a bunch of suits in, and this is one of the reasons why, by the way, California high-speed rail is absolutely in the toilet, and it's still going through the approval process 13 years later after they said that they were going to go forward with it.
Somebody with an 8th grade dropout education like my father could not duplicate his path from poverty to the middle class if he worked 3 jobs. That's because the cost of living has gotten so outrageous here in California, largely because of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that enables virtually anybody to stop anything for almost any reason. That's why the average price of a home in California is $800,000. The average price of a home in California is 150% the national average. And I think I could do something about that. One of the frequent guests I have on my radio program is an economist, brilliant economist named Leo Hanian. He teaches at UCLA, and he says because of CEQA and other policies, the average price of a home in California is literally 50% more than it otherwise would be.
Now, one of the ways that you know this is actually a legitimate thing that needed to be addressed is that Larry Elder, in his recall campaign for governor, as documented by Kirk Wilcox, was actually running in large part against this particular law because it has been shown time and time again to be the key factor in why housing is so expensive in the state of California. And you guys really need to understand that although this law is associated with the environment, it actually was passed well before global warming was a concern, and oftentimes what it is concerned with protecting is the environment as it is currently existing as of 1970 to residents at the time that the law was passed. So you have a bunch of different things that allow residents to sue construction projects if, again, the building is too tall and it stops blocking their light to their home, or if that they think it will be too loud and thus there will be noise pollution, they could bog down the developer in a bunch of different various lawsuits.
This is California's high housing costs, causes and consequences. This was a report from the Legislative Analyst Office, LAO. This is a government agency in the state of California, nonpartisan, and they are mainly focused on providing fiscal and policy advice to the state legislature in California. So it's nonpartisan. It's not like this is some fringe, wacko, conspiracy, right-wing think tank. But then we go down here. This report mentions, as you can see, the California Environmental Quality Act. Requires local governments to conduct a detailed review of the potential environmental effects of new housing construction and most other types of development prior to approving it. The information in these reports sometimes results in the city or county denying proposals to develop housing or approving fewer housing units than the developer proposed, kind of like what Larry Elder was just talking about. In addition, CEQA's complicated procedural requirements give development opponents significant opportunities to continue challenging housing projects after local governments have approved them.
And in fact, California has something called a Legislative Analyst Office, and every so often they produce a report on the affordability crisis in the state of California, and multiple reports have come to the same conclusion. CEQA is the reason why housing is so expensive. It's not the only reason, but it's a huge driving factor behind it, and let me explain to you why. Because it's not just people who are able to sue based on ridiculous things like, oh, it's going to shade my home too much or something of the sort. You also have a bunch of different special interest groups that are able to sue developers, and ultimately what this ends up doing is it puts a starting point 2-year burden on every single project in the state of California to conduct an environmental impact review. Then after they finalize their review and try to address the consequences that they uncover, they then can be sued by different environmental groups or any impacted party. And oftentimes what people do is they sue under this law as a mechanism in order to force something else that they want that has nothing to do with the environment. As Kirk Wilcox documents in this absolutely wonderful video that I will link in the description, and I heavily recommend you watch it in its entirety because it is one of the best videos on the topic that's out there. This has become the tool of unions in order to extort higher wages out of the developers of certain projects rather than the strong collective bargaining protections that actually exist in the state of California. Because the CEQA lawsuits take about 2 years to resolve, it actually makes more sense for them to file these suits, say that they're going to bog down the developer in court for years in order to leverage that lawsuit in order to get what they want out of the developer. And in fact, this report by the California Legislative Authority ended up discovering multiple different instances where 2 different unions were trying to sue in order to make sure their employees were paid for a specific job at the same time as, again, a distraction or an alternate tactic to get what they want that had nothing to do with the environment. And of course, the builder, the developer, ended up going under and the project never got done.
Construction trade unions were more likely to be identified in petitions than other trade unions, but unions filing CEQA lawsuits typically do not identify themselves as a union. Labor tends to use CEQA litigation and litigation threats to gain control of project job allocations and wages, but also uses CEQA in disputes with other labor unions. In the high percentage of renewable projects in the Southern California desert that were threatened or sued under CEQA, for example, 2 different labor petitioner groups, each affiliated with a different construction trade union, each filed their own CEQA lawsuit against the same project. This occurred in a reported dispute over which union would control the jobs created by these projects, and the competing unions used CEQA lawsuits in lieu of using federal regulatory process for resolving territorial disputes. Labor CEQA lawsuits were filed even for jobs requiring payment of prevailing wages and other negotiated terms that are generally perceived as favorable by the community and policy stakeholders.
You can't have a system like this. And it turns out, time and time again, what we see is that the places that get sued happen to be high-density housing that would, of course, increase supply dramatically, which, of course, would drop rents.
You can see right here, the most frequently challenged housing type is multifamily projects, typically multi-story apartments and condominiums. Some of these projects are also mixed use and have, for example, retail stores or office space on lower floors and residential units on upper floors. Every multifamily project within the survey sample was also an infill project, which means infill project. Let's bring that up. I just want to get this definition out of the way. It refers to a building within an unused or underutilized lands within existing development patterns.
By increasing supply, yet since 1970, these projects have been sued into oblivion time and time again.
In addition, lower density luxury housing often pencils out more favorably from a local government standpoint than higher density moderate cost housing. This is because the luxury housing generates higher levels of property tax revenue per resident. Don't worry, guys. If you can't afford housing, well, good news. All this new tax revenue, maybe the government can give you free goodies to help you better afford your apartment. Not surprisingly, given these incentives, many cities and counties have oriented their land use planning and approval process disproportionately toward the development of commercial establishments and away from higher density multifamily housing.
Now, one of the most interesting things about this supposed environmental legislation is that luxury developments are often the only developments that never get sued under this ordinance, and there's a reason for that. Think about it logically. Let's say you could use the government, if you're a current homeowner or property owner in the state of California, to ensure that your property value will always go up. In addition to that, if you happen to already rent existing units in a very scarce economy, you can ensure that the rental values that you can get, again, can always go up by suing developers that are going to try to make high density housing that, again, will increase supply to a certain extent that should drop rents, because, again, it is just regulated by supply and demand. And as we've seen in cities in Texas, as we've seen in Nashville, Tennessee, and all over the country where we don't have these ridiculous rules, when supply goes up, prices level off, or they reduce, or they grow significantly slower than when you constrict supply like California has since the 1970s. But if you're building a luxury house, something that is obviously going to be multi-millions of dollars in somebody else's neighborhood, that actually increases the value of the properties around that particular house because the neighborhood is moving on up. Now, when you understand that dynamic, suddenly it makes sense why all of the lawsuits that bog down regular ordinary apartment buildings seem to pile up versus luxury apartments or luxury homes that don't exist, because that increases the value of the property of the people in this particular neighborhood. And ultimately what that ends up doing is helping them out, so there's no reason to sue whether there's environmental concerns or not. This is the way that CEQA gets abused. And by the way, it is not just by the unions. It is not just by property owners that live in the area. It's also by every single special interest group who have their own protections, who have their own regulations to back them, like the environmentalists, like all these woke DEI organizations. It turns out CEQA makes it so easy to sue developers for anything that these people do it in order to achieve goals that, again, the state of California already caters to in other legislation. Let's say you want more black people on the crew because you're one of these woke DEI organizations who thinks that the projects need to have construction crews that represent the community by an exact pie chart. Well, you could sue under civil rights law, but the fact is they're not that strong in order to enforce your racial mandate. Or you could sue due to an environmental concern, saying that they're shading your property or some such ridiculous thing. And it turns out that's going to take years to resolve. And then while that's resolving, you can offer a settlement to the particular developer that says, hey, if you hire more black people or more gays or more Hispanics or more whoever, then we'll drop the lawsuit. So again, this is the number one extortion tactic of all these different various organizations. And that's why a wide array of groups that would seemingly have nothing to do with CEQA and these particular lifts on restrictions have come out opposed to this and are absolutely enraged at Gavin Newsom. And by the way, the exceptions that he has are for, again, buildings under 50 apartment units, and they're in what are called infill areas, which means already urban areas. So these are minor tweaks, but again, they have major consequences for all these extortion groups, and that's why these people are so mad. That's why you see a whole smattering of organizations that sure are vaguely left-wing, but in reality, they don't seem to meet the specific goals of the environment that were supposedly laid out by CEQA initially. In addition to that, a bunch of these environmental groups that you've never heard of are just masks for the very organizations that I was talking about.
Also talks about non-construction unions are even less likely to be named in CEQA positions, in part due to federal law restrictions on the manner in which such unions are allowed to use unconventional tactics like CEQA to bargain over wage and working condition issues with their employers. By far the largest category of these cases involves CEQA challenges to non-union retailers, particularly Walmart. Lawsuits filed against Walmart and similar projects were all filed by local groups with environmental-sounding names, although union backing of such lawsuits was well known, and open union opposition to such projects was clear in the administration agency approval process.
Now look, while Gavin Newsom is taking his victory lap, the fact is this whole stupid law should go, period, point blank, because we already have federal minimums, and the fact is this is well beyond the federal minimums in order to complete this project. So what you have is duplicative regulation at the statewide level that of course encourage duplicative regulation at the local municipality level, which is why Los Angeles is now debating whether or not they are going to repeal their CEQA-like regulations in order to hopefully have this actually have impact for the residents of the state of California. But I do want to give Gavin Newsom credit for actually taking on the affordability crisis in a non-stupid way, or at least a partially non-stupid way, because this is very narrowly tailored and it only fits certain circumstances, and that ambiguity plus regulatory burden here versus there is ultimately going to prevent this from being the rousing success that these policies of being pro-builder have been in many places in the state of Texas. But I want to get into a little bit more than just that part of the CEQA stuff, because there's other things that I find incredibly interesting that were tacked along with this. And yeah, it just goes to show you that the state of California can't help but shoot itself in the foot partially, even if their foot was slightly near the target that they actually needed to hit. Now, like I said, the CEQA reforms actually sound pretty good. It's just unfortunate that they're limited to only certain areas. But here are some good aspects that I did not highlight. Obviously, we talked about the housing and infrastructure projects, including infill housing, high-speed rail facilities, utilities, broadband, community serving facilities, wildfire prevention, and farm work housing. So the reason this is good is not only because of the housing benefits that I told you about earlier, but in addition to that, they're also fixing the things that prevent them from doing controlled burns or changing the infrastructure in the power lines that, by the way, they were blocked from doing ahead of the Palisades fire. Both of those things, Gavin Newsom pretended that they weren't, but obviously they were. So this is a good change, even if Gavin Newsom is a total snake, not trying to acknowledge that he made these changes, because again, he said those problems didn't even exist before. But they will be able to do more controlled burns, build fire breaks, and of course they will be able to replace utility poles that are decaying, that again, they were blocked specifically by environmentalist lawsuits from doing before. They're also trying to speed up housing permits and eliminate coastal commission housing appeals, which again are rich people on the coast trying to block and sue over every single project. Now, they also want to freeze residential building standards through 2031, which is good, but there are exceptions for emergency fire and conservation related updates, so that could basically undo everything. And then there's ridiculously stupid government financing nonsense that doesn't need to exist. Again, if you cleared this out, the high prices would encourage builders to build. You shouldn't have to spend any money financing these projects. But of course, California is going to California, and for some ungodly reason, they decided to expand their renter's tax credit, which is just so unfathomably stupid when you figure that these people are already dealing with skyrocketing rents, that the state of California decided it would be a good idea to subsidize the demand side of rent. Again, just think about it, and I'll give you a broad example so you can understand. Let's say the federal government decided that they were going to give everyone $1 million in order to buy a house. What do you think the consequence of that $1 million in everybody's pockets only to buy a house would be? That would ultimately raise housing prices by approximately $1 million. Now, of course, if you give subsidies to some groups or some classes or whatever, then that will bid up the prices as well. It won't be as extreme as the example that I gave. But yeah, expanding this program when rents are already high is incredibly stupid. This is why Kamala Harris's extra credit for mortgages was stupid. This is why California's statewide credit that they wanted to add for first-time home buyers was also stupid. Again, we don't need more subsidies for demand. What we need is to build up more supply. Now, look, obviously this is a step in the right direction, and make no mistake about it, it is a cynical step in the right direction because Gavin Newsom wants to run for president. Affordability problems are a huge issue in the state of California that would end up hurting him in a presidential run. So he has decided that he's going to make this move year 7 into him being governor after he was lieutenant governor before that, even though everybody has been able to identify these programs for decades as the problem, and Gavin Newsom was a fierce defender of this nonsense for all that time. But you know what? Better late than never. A correct move or a reasonably or directionally correct move for cynical reasons is okay, but I just want everybody out there in the audience to know that you should never vote for Gavin Newsom for president because he's an absolute scumbag in every possible way. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. If you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about California actually kind of doing something decent. Till next time.